Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for the program this afternoon. My name is Angela Davis, and I'm a member of the Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The SAB is a bipartisan group. As a member of the SAB, I get to access many great opportunities by being involved with the Institute. If you are a KU student and you're interested in joining, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. For this afternoon's event, if you would like to know more about our guest, the event itself, upcoming Institute events, and more, you can download a printable program handout. The link is in the event description below. At the end of this event, we will have time for you to ask questions of our guest. Please email your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sean Kalik.
Thank you, Angela. I appreciate it. I have the pleasure today of talking to you guys about aerospace theory. So what we'll do is we have about 45 minutes. We'll talk about the evolution and how this idea within the United States Air Force evolves really from about 1945 to really about 1959 when it becomes part of doctrine. We'll have questions at the end, and then we'll go from there, okay? So without further ado, here we go. And we'll start at the beginning, right? So we all tend to assume the Air Force does air power. But what we're going to talk about today is really in the 1950s, the Air Force starts to expand its construct beyond just air power and starts thinking and talking about aerospace power, which if you think about and if you follow kind of military matters today, we start talking about multi-domain operations, which you have land, sea, air, space, and cyber. And the reality is, this multi-domain concept is alive and well, I would argue, in the 1950s with the Air Force and their concept of aerospace, which sees space really as one indivisible operational medium. So air and space, although they have different characteristics, become the domain of the Air Force from their purview. And we'll talk about how this concept evolves and where it comes from, because it also involves really the civilian space program, the space race, the Eisenhower administration, and ultimately what the Air Force is doing and how they're conceptualizing a future battlefield that will encompass both air and space as one medium, okay? Then we get through that, we'll take some questions and we'll go from there, okay? So let's start with the beginning, which really is kind of 1945, 1946, right after the end of the Second World War. Rockets, of course, have made an appearance on the scene, and the United States and the Soviet Union have sent intelligence teams in to collect copious amounts of research data and scientists, by the way. As a result, we have the Navy commander, Harvey Hall, is interested in this research and development element of really outer space. And he starts thinking about how can we use space in the future. And really, he's looking at kind of engineering needs and feasibility studies. What will it take to put a satellite into orbit? And actually, Commander Hall sends a memorandum to Army Air Force General at the time, Curtis LeMay, who's in charge of research right at the end of the war. And Hall proposes a joint research project, which they think about what's the feasibility, both the engineering, science, research, necessary to put an Earth-circling spaceship in orbit. So essentially, how do we build a man-made satellite to do something in this new environment with rocket technology that we have seen coming out of the Second World War? Now, what's interesting is that the minute that LeMay gets this...
Click that hide button, and I think we'll be okay.
Pardon me? I'm getting some feedback, but I think we're good. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll focus on, Mark, is everything okay? Sorry, folks.
Let's go back to your PowerPoint slides. We've lost your PowerPoint slides. You may make those full screen.
That good? I apologize, folks. Technical difficulty. All right, so the Navy's going to send a memorandum to the Army Air Force to ask if they would like to cooperate on a feasibility study about Earth circling spaceships. And LeMay gets the memorandum and he reads it, and he's not really happy about it because his first question is, why is the Navy interested in space? And second of all, why is what becomes the Air Force going to do something about it? So essentially what he does before he answers Commander Hall's note, he actually talks to the folks at the Douglas Aircraft Corporation. And they have a small little think tank that's burgeoning, that's based on research and development, RAND, right? And LeMay says, hey, we have this idea about how can we use, or what's the feasibility of building an Earth-circling spaceship? So he actually lets a contract in May 2nd, 1946 to the RAND Corporation, what becomes the RAND Corporation, to really investigate the feasibility of this study. And then he's going to send a note to the Navy saying, no, we're not really interested. We have other things on our mind and our priority, i.e., really the Cold War's starting to kind of ramp up. So LeMay is going to focus on the Berlin airlift, bombers, all kinds of fun stuff that we come to associate with. But it really is the first moment that the Air Force, or the Army Air Force, is going to really stake a claim that anything kind of in from air breathing beyond is really the domain of the Air Force, despite the fact that both the Army and the Navy are both working on rocket technology and feasibility studies as well. But what happens is LeMay is going to set a precedent. The Air Force believes it's going to be one continual operational domain. So once the Air Force becomes independent in 47, they're going to perpetuate this idea that if they control airspace, they should also control outer space. And we'll see how that evolves through time. So I would argue it really starts here in 45, 46, and then it's going to be perpetuated by RAND and then Air Force contracts that are going to kind of sustain this idea about, can we build a satellite, and if we can, how do we use it? And the Air Force is going to be significantly committed to this project, right? So the RAND project studying satellites, really the two folks at RAND that are driving the process are Louis Ridnour and Frank Colboom. And they're really the guys that were kind of shepherding this program. And there's this whole series of not just reports, but also internal conferences at RAND from 46 up through 1950, where they focused on satellites, both what is the engineering and science necessary to build them. And it's not just building the satellite as a construct, but also how do you build a rocket to get that element into space? Because one of the big problems is they think they can build a satellite, but they don't have the ability to get that satellite into space. So there's a thrust versus weight kind of problem going on. And until they can develop the appropriate booster to get into space, they're going to focus on how do you build a satellite and then different missions, essentially. Now, what's important to note is that the RAND Corporation early on in this discussion makes a specific notation that satellites are inherently different from other weapon systems in the fact that they aren't necessarily designed to kill people or kill things, or both. They have this kind of unique psychological element to them that it really, if you're the first nation that can actually demonstrate this amazing feat, you should be able to sway large parts of the world to essentially embrace the fact that the United States has superior science and technology. So we have to kind of frame this within the construct of the Cold War as well. Now, once they make that point, they also build upon the idea that satellites are inherently different from other weapon systems. And really, they start focusing on really communication, reconnaissance, navigation, targeting, and intelligence. So they see a value for satellites and how they can help the military services, but there is this distinction that they're really not a weapon system. And what's unique is if you go back and read the very first RAND study, they make points about, well, if you use it as a bombing platform and it's in space, if you go to release the weapon from the platform, it's just going to float away. So there's no discussion about how do you actually, pull something out of orbit into the Earth's atmosphere. So it really is rudimentary science and understanding of what outer space is. Now, that's all going to change as you move forward, but this idea that you start to see the evolution of what becomes a theory really 45, 46, and then it's going to build upon itself. But what RAND and the Air Force tends to focus on is this, these 5 missions. Now, the Air Force is going to take it one step further because, after all, they're a military service. But the reality is these 5 core missions really become the backbone of what becomes the militarization of space. And we'll talk about that as it moves through time, because RAND really is, I would argue, one of the major think tanks that's driving the Air Force interest in space. I mean, it's happening through the Truman administration. Truman doesn't pay a whole lot of attention to it because he's really concerned about how do you kind of reorient the United States to the Cold War. SAC is somewhat interested, but would rather prefer to spend its money on bombers and atomic weapons. There's a small cadre of Air Force officers that start to gleam on to the research being done at RAND, and they're going to use it as a means to project itself as really the source that reserves the opportunity to maintain this operational medium between air and space. And one of those first Air Force officers is Charles P. Cabell, who is actually part of the Air Intelligence Division. And we're moving up to about 1950 now, right at the end of the end of the Truman administration, beginning of the Eisenhower administration. And Cabell, having served in the Second World War and now is involved in intelligence, what is Strategic Air Command, has several problems. The first problem is that it has really poor intelligence over the Soviet Union. So as the Cold War heats up, one of the important elements that you need if you're going to start building war plans is you need target intelligence, you need good weather intelligence, you need the ability to conduct prompt bomb damage assessment. And if you think about this, this is kind of how you prosecute a campaign, right? Like in the Second World War, you want to have the ability to look at a map and pick out specific targets. And after you send missions to hit those targets, you want the ability to look at those targets and see what you damage and how you have to kind of maintain and continue your campaign to achieve your strategic objective. Part of that also, as you're flying over, is weathering, right? What are the weather patterns predominantly over at the target sites as you move, throughout the seasons. So Cabell actually starts reading the RAND reports and starts pushing memorandums up through the Air Force, right? Because the Air Force becomes independent in 47, and saying that, SAC can actually use these, and we can actually use satellites for helping us develop the intelligence we need for future war plans. So we can use them for prompt bomb damage assessment, which really is the same as photo reconnaissance, which you saw in the previous. So there's some overlap between kind of civilian military applications and kind of the use of the military for war plans and conducting operations. Weather's the second element, right, which wasn't on the original RAND report, but evolves through time. If you have kind of the ability to kind of see down, you could actually observe weather and get it and understand patterns and things like that, which is eminently helpful to the Air Force, because at this time they're really sending balloons aloft to get information and data, and those are sketchy at best, let's put it. And then the last one is really targeting, that if you can do prompt bomb damage assessment and weather, you can also possibly develop cameras where you can look down and start to pick out targets and therefore build target sets and build missions, campaigns, strategic air elements to actually fight and win a war if and when you need to. So Cabell, I would argue, is one of the first identifiable officers that starts to apply the technical application that the RAND engineers and scientists are playing with to the specific missions of the Air Force. Because if you look at the Key West agreements, right, the Air Force is given the nuclear mission, which becomes really the prominent element of Strategic Air Command, or SAC. And one of the big problems they have as they move through really the late 40s, early 50s is developing the intelligence necessary to conduct those operations. And Cabell is the guy who starts to see space as a means to achieve those objectives. Now, the other benefit of space that Cabell talks about is that you don't have to risk air crews and pilots to do it, which is significant, right? So you don't have to fly ferreting missions, which the Air Force is doing in the 40s and 50s, to kind of, observe radar sites and to get signatures for electronic intelligence and everything. And you always run the risk of that getting shot down. In fact, there's some really good books out there that talk about the Air Force's Need to Know, which is the name of a book, and the missions that are being flown, and really the dangers that's associated with it. In the United States, it loses quite a few aircraft and crews as they attempt to develop this necessary intelligence. So Cabell sees space as a way to minimize the risk to air crews and aircraft, but also possibly improve the capabilities of the intelligence we have vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and satellites become that means to that end. Okay. Now, the next big kind of catalyst or impetus for this really is Eisenhower and the space program. So you kind of have two tracks coming into this. You have the military Air Force side, but you also have to understand what the Eisenhower administration is doing, because the Eisenhower administration is going to build upon the work the Air Force has done during the Truman administration, because they see space as a significant plank in the Cold War. And this goes back to that original RAND study and then the previous 2 or 3 that are done in the late 40s and early 50s that continually highlight the point that the first nation that can demonstrate the ability to launch a man-made satellite is going to have significant international prestige. And the second point that follows from that is it's going to demonstrate superior technological and scientific superiority and engineering, by the way. So the Eisenhower administration is going to see space as really a way to challenge the Soviet Union and to demonstrate that the United States really is a superior nation based upon its ability to launch satellites into space. Now, Eisenhower plays a unique position here because he knows the Air Force is moving towards this idea of commanding the high ground, which I'll talk about in a few seconds here. But Eisenhower plays this concept of we have to be kind of very careful about this. In fact, there's a fantastic memorandum that he writes after the National Security Council meeting in 1956, where he's being pushed to essentially challenge the Soviets. And he says, listen, the reality is we're not in the 100-yard dash with the Soviets. We're in the mile run. So what we have to do is kind of pace ourselves. We have to ensure we have a strategy and a plan, because what we don't want to do is essentially run ourselves out where we're tired and we run out of steam. So we pace ourselves. And part of this construct for Eisenhower is, which we'll talk about, is you let the military kind of do their part, but the reality is you use the science side as a means to demonstrate that you're not just about controlling space, that you're really about preserving space as a scientific frontier. And we'll talk about the difference between militarization and weaponization as we kind of move through this discussion, which is kind of a tertiary discussion with aerospace theory. So we're going to see the evolution of what becomes a civilian space program and really a military space program, because the Eisenhower specifically and then his administration starts to see this as a means to really demonstrate that the Soviets are really all about commanding the high ground, i.e. the Soviet military will own space and use it for strategic purposes, whereas the United States is about preserving it. And the phrase they keep using is for all of mankind. And they link it to like the seabed treaties, Antarctica treaties. The reality is there are moments where the international community gets together and preserves elements for the sanctity of all mankind. And they see space as that, but they also recognize that it also has significant military purposes. All right, so the last 2 points on this slide is to help codify this construct of space as a international scientific endeavor is the International Geophysical Year, which they believe is going to happen in 57, 58. And it's an attempt to kind of demonstrate the world can get together and do one awesome scientific mission, with the United States culminating this event with the launching of the first satellite, which is the Vanguard satellite program. And what's unique is Eisenhower is very focused on this has to be a civilian program using rockets and satellites. Now, the problem is the only elements that are actually, or the only elements, the only folks that are building rockets tend to be the military in this time period. So you're going to have to use military boosters, i.e. missiles, and re-engineer elements of them to make them kind of look like civilian rockets. So hence, a rocket is not a missile, but the reality is most differences ends up being on the front end and maybe some painting on the side of the rocket, and we'll talk about that. And this process is really codified in NSC 5520, which is the national security document that talks about how the United States is going to move forward with a U.S. satellite program that highlights both military elements and civilian elements. But it's very specific about maintaining civilian openness to space and using space for military purposes, i.e. reconnaissance, weather, communication, those 5 elements that the RAND Corporation identified early on, rather than weaponizing space. Now, the Air Force is going to be much more focused on what we're going to see as weaponizing space, but the Eisenhower administration and previous administrations are going to be steadfastly committed to preserving space as a scientific frontier. Now, this is an interesting element. So we're kind of moving back and forth, and you're probably saying, what does this have to do with aerospace? Well, we're getting through the kind of Eisenhower scientific context and what's going on, which has a profound impact on the Air Force and their movement for embracing the uses of space to this concept of aerospace. So sit with me, because, historians like to build context, right? So that's what we're doing right now. So up through 57, really 52 to 57, the Eisenhower administration vehemently believes it's going to be the first nation. The United States is going to be the first nation in space. That we're going to win the space race. We're going to put the first satellite in space, and it's going to bring all these great international accolades. It's going to help pull some nations into our orbit, pun intended, right? During the Cold War. And in January to August of 1957, director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, is providing really the National Security Council and Eisenhower with information that the Soviet Union is testing a rocket with either a atomic warhead on top and or a satellite. And it's the Soviet R-7, which becomes their first operational ICBM. And the point that Dulles keeps making, specifically in the summer of 57, is that they do their first operational test around July 57 of the R-7, and it doesn't have a warhead on top of it. It has some other kind of civilian-looking thing on top, which everyone is speculating, that it may be a satellite. But Dulles keeps reiterating the point that, okay, going to space is awesome. It could have this significant benefit, but the reality is if the Soviets launch something into space, it also demonstrates they have the capability to reach the United States with an ICBM. So that's where that rocket and missile kind of construct is in many ways an artificial facade, because if this, from the Soviet perspective and CIA's perspective, what this means is that this what we're going to call a missile gap is maybe evolving. And that gets back to the idea of we really don't know how many missiles they have because our intelligence is really not that good. Now, the reality behind it is the Soviet Union is charged kind of headlong into satellite research and development, much like the United States sort of did at the end of the Second World War. In fact, the Soviets, also took away copious amounts of information, parts, and scientists too, and then they plunged resources into that effort, which is going to ultimately culminate October 4th, 1957, with the launch of Sputnik. And Sputnik is impressive in the fact that it's a silver basketball that beeps, right? And it really is the first satellite. So it has a significant kind of impact in the world that Eisenhower was kind of focusing on. That, if our Vanguard system can get there, fantastic. It's going to bring all this accolade. But what happens when you think you're going to win the race and then you lose the race, or you lose the first part of the race, right? Maybe your splits are a bit off. And what's interesting when you read Eisenhower's comments about this, Eisenhower, remember that comment about the long run or the mile run, not the 100-yard dash? Eisenhower's a bit perplexed in the fact that he can't understand why folks in the United States are so troubled by the fact that there's the Soviet basketball kind of beeping. In fact, he comments to his national security staff that really this is nothing but a simple thrust to weight ratio problem. They just solved it before we did. Now the reality is Eisenhower realizes that the Air Force is charging headlong into the development of satellites, specifically spy satellites. So he sees that we have this program that we really can't release to the public, but we lost civilian prestige, but we have kind of other irons in the fire that should pay greater dividends. So yes, you lose prestige. He's not going to necessarily race because he doesn't want to bankrupt the United States. But what he does, and this is where he kind of makes this significant split in October '58, he creates the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And this is the attempt to demonstrate we have a civilian space program, which is going to preserve space for all of mankind and share our research and development with other nations and go and do great things. At the same time, though, we're going to maintain what is really a black covert military space program, which is what the Air Force is going to parlay its aerospace concept off of. So we have two, all right? And here is the beginnings of the military space program, which actually WS-117L. WS stands for weapon system, and the 117L is just a designator based upon the fact that this is being developed at the Western Development Division in the Air Force, which is a unique command. Think of it as the R&D and science and tech element of the Air Force. It becomes the Air Force Research and Development Command, but in this period, it has a kind of generic name of Western Development Division, and it's in Los Angeles, California. And this WS-117L is really a program of a bunch of different weapon systems, i.e. satellites. So it really is the two main ones, the two main satellites, at least in the beginning, are the Midas System, which is a missile defense alarm system. Midas, so MI, missile, defense alarm system. And it's designed to have infrared detection capability. And the idea is if the Soviet Union are developing ICBMs, we need some type of early warning. You may have heard of the distance early warning radar systems. The idea is if you can get a satellite in orbit over the Soviet Union, it can look down with infrared capability and see the plumes of missiles and possibly give you early warning of missiles that may be incoming, which is pretty significant. So Midas is part of this WS-117L system. So you can see how we've moved kind of quickly from photo reconnaissance, weather, communication, to now talking about using them for specific defensive purposes or intelligence purposes like infrared detection. The second one is photo reconnaissance, or the Corona system, or keyhole. Now, what's unique is that this is actually the way the CIA and Air Force work together on Corona is you have a civilian version, which is called Discovery, but at the same time, it's also the same Corona / keyhole mission. So you kind of hide it by putting it out in the open and letting people see it and look at it. But the reality also has a secret mission, which becomes a photo reconnaissance satellite. Now, WS-117L also has other elements within it, like Dinosaur, which I'll talk about in a few seconds here, and another satellite program called SAINT, which is all about a satellite interceptor, because the idea is if the Soviet Union can put Sputnik in space and the United States is working on spy satellites, that we're going to need a capability to kind of inspect a satellite and possibly kill it, i.e. SAINT, right? Where you can put a satellite in orbit, it can go up to an enemy satellite, observe it, see if it's hostile or not, and if it's hostile, it can kinetically kill it. Interesting concept. So again, we're starting to move away from that official RAND idea that they're inherently different weapon systems, but again, the Air Force is starting to see these as not only do you need passive military elements in space, but if space is going to be a contested environment, you may need the capability to defend and or deny space from your enemy. And 117L, the programs in that provide the whole span of ideas as far as engineering, research, and development of satellite systems and weapon systems that can do that. Now, the follow-on, so that really WS-117L comes out July 56 when NASA is created in 58. Eisenhower's going to briefly take these missions or the research on these elements, and he's going to send them to what becomes DARPA. Well, at that time, it's ARPA, because he's concerned that we're wasting money by duplication. And within about 3 months, the Air Force actually has the programs back, because simply they are Air Force programs. The Air Force is well down the road on most of these. And Eisenhower realizes after significant Air Force briefings that the Air Force is way ahead on development of these systems. Those constructs are going to be codified in NSC 5814/1 in August of 58, where we start talking about movement beyond just satellites, and now we're going to have manned defensive outer space vehicles. And again, I'll talk about Dinosaur here in a second, and the Manned Orbital Lab, or MOLE, right? Bombardment satellites. So the idea, which the RAND guys talked about in 46, is coming back to roost, that maybe bombers just aren't useful, maybe satellites can be even better. Manned lunar stations, where you can have communication, reconnaissance, and here's a big one, right? Missile sites even. Now, again, this is just an element coming out of, it really is thinking big about how the military can use space, and these three elements on manned lunar stations become significant. But remember when I talked about Eisenhower and his commitment to preserving space as a scientific frontier. The missile sites on the moon become somewhat problematic for Eisenhower, as do bombardment satellites, because he sees those as weaponizing space. So there's a fine line that he's going to tread between militarizing space, which is kind of the use of space for those 5 missions, right, versus putting weapons in space. And the services are pushing for weapons in space because as the Cold War construct, you want to ensure that you are not losing space, or i.e. the high ground, to the Soviet Union. And the Air Force's concept of aerospace is going to feed into this, okay? And the model that gets us going, right, is air power is space power. That the Air Force starts playing with this idea that you need photo reconnaissance, but if you need photo reconnaissance, but it also gives you, discovery, Corona, you can also use that for things that Cabell talked about, right? But ultimately, you want to control the high ground, right? Which is probably one of the oldest military maxims: is control the high ground, right? He who controls the high ground controls what goes on underneath, right? Overwatch, all those fun elements that you learn in kind of basic school, right? And the Air Force is going to keep pushing Eisenhower that you can't lose this race, that if you cede space and you lose space, the United States will be under the thumb of the Soviet Union. So they really play this up that you have to go the next step to weaponize space, because if you don't, you're going to lose it. And therefore, the United States is going to be essentially a hostage to what they call the red moon or red space. And the Air Force recognizes the role in NASA, right? Because they have a close relationship with NASA. If you think about the X-planes, specifically like the X-20, and then Dinosaur is going to be ultimately evolve into the X-20, X-15, X-20. They start talking about, see, these space programs aren't just military in nature, right? So the Dinosaur doesn't just look like a space bomber, but the reality is it's also going to give us lots of research on how do you dynamically re-enter the environment of space. So how do you deorbit something? How does it come down and land again? Which, if you think space shuttle, this is kind of the predecessor to the space shuttle. But the reality is NASA is also working on what becomes Mercury and Gemini. And Eisenhower is continually asking, okay, the Air Force is doing research, but the reality is, well, how is your research on reentry different from what NASA is doing in Gemini and Mercury? And the Air Force will hem and haw and say, well, we're getting different data based upon dynamic soaring, which is what Dinosaur stands for, versus kind of straight reentry. And it really is kind of slicing the paper relatively thin, because the Air Force really wants to get to this idea of weaponizing space. They vehemently believe that you need to control the high ground, and space needs to be preserved as a platform that may need to be weaponized as a construct of the Cold War. So they see a role for NASA, but the reality is they're pushing towards this construct of what becomes aerospace. All right, now we're going to get into the meat of what aerospace, how it starts to evolve. So the foundations are there. I think you understand the construct and the context. Now we'll talk about kind of the Air Force folks beyond Cabell that really perpetuate and drive this construct of what becomes aerospace, because that aerospace word really isn't used until about 1957. And these gentlemen that I'm going to show the next 4 or 5 slides are the ones that are pushing the idea of what becomes aerospace. All right. And you can see Bernard Schriever's quote here about the importance of space and space superiority, which is a good encapsulation of that idea that I just talked about, that the important battles of the future may not be on the sea or the land, but ultimately space, which is this construct of, air and space is one continuous operational medium. Bernard Schriever is an interesting guy. Really, he's the father of, the U.S. Air Force missiles. He is the commander of the Western Development Division. And he's going to serve in that role for roughly 4 or 5 years at really the height of the space race from really, I think, 56 to about 60 or 61. And he's going to go on to command the Army Research and Development Command. So he's a scientist and engineer who understands these things, but he's also pushing this idea that it's not just about hardware. It's not about satellites and rockets and weapon systems. You also have to think about the theoretical element of what space is. So we have to move beyond just land, air, and sea. Now start thinking about land, sea, air, and space, by the way. And we can't allow it to slip through our fingertips, because if we do, in this global construct of the Cold War, we're fighting communism, we will lose, and life as we know will substantially change. All right. Now, this kind of runs afoul of Eisenhower, right? Because as I said, Eisenhower is really about regaining international prestige. He wants to work for peaceful purposes. He's working through the UN. And there's this debate within really the Eisenhower administration, really militarization versus weaponization. And the Eisenhower administration is pushing really the militarization, which allows for kind of passive satellites, but not space bombers, not missile bases on the moon, not terrestrial satellites that can, drop tungsten rods and kill things on the Earth. So you have this kind of internal tension within really the Air Force and the administration, and the Air Force is really trying to convince Eisenhower that you need space as a militarized element if and when you have to fight the Soviets. But to Eisenhower's credit, he's going to push, no. sit tight. Let's go with militarization, not weaponization, but that doesn't stop the Air Force. So all right. Martin Schofield is at the Air War College. So you have Shriver, who's producing the idea about the next domain, i.e. space. And Schofield is going to start talking about control of outer space. How do you control and contest it? In fact, Everett Dolman down at the Air University, I think he works at SAS, which is kind of their second-year course, is probably one of the better theorists in the contemporary period who writes on this. And he has awesome books called Astropolitique, and then some really awesome articles that talk about the difference between control and contesting space. And he goes back in time and uses kind of traditional geopolitical theory, Mahanian naval theory, to talk about this idea. And Schofield is kind of much in that vein, right? So if Shriver is going to set the big idea that this is really the next domain, Schofield is going to be the one who starts thinking about how do you use it from a military perspective, right? That it's about a serious threat to our national security. We have to ensure that space vehicles of other states don't pose this significant threat. Because again, back to that age-old adage, he who controls the high ground. So Schofield's going to start working within kind of the larger army at Air University to ensure that the ideas that Cabell pitched early in the 50s, you have Shriver, 57, and now in 58 are getting traction, at least within the scientific kind of more theoretical side of the Air Force. Here's another one from Schofield about really the need to control the high ground. The Air Force is really, this is really the plank of their theory, that if you take that the United States is really involved in this ideological Cold War with the Soviet Union, and it really is a contest of wills, that you cannot allow the Soviet Union to gain any ground, right? So it really, in many constructs, it's a zero-sum game for them. And space becomes the ultimate high ground for the Air Force, that you can't allow the Soviets to get a foothold in space, because if they do, they're going to use it to their strategic advantage. And you can see Schofield's comments here, right? Is around serious attention as long-range weapon carriers, right? So the idea that if you can put a satellite in space, you can also use it to carry nuclear weapons and therefore reconnaissance vehicles. So space is starting to grow in both passive and active elements. And again, Schofield seems, I'm not able to find any pictures of Schofield, by the way, as I did kind of extensive research on this. But in 58, he's doing some significant writing for Air University Quarterly Review about expanding the Air Force's construct of understanding space as a next logical extension of air power. So again, air power is space power. We are now starting to kind of merge those domains into one. So we have, Cabell, Shriver, Schofield, and now General Thomas White, Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, is going to get on board. And again, if you look at the dates, this is all happening really 57 to 58, and we're going to end in 59. So this is a pretty intense kind of period, right? So if you think Sputnik, 57, right, October, you see the comments earlier by Shriver in February 57, 58 becomes a really important year, because that becomes a year where everyone's starting to think about how do you maintain momentum and ensure the Soviets don't get the foothold in space. And now you have the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Thomas White, saying, we have to win this fight. And he makes this long speech at the Air Forces Association's, the Third Jet Age Conference, which is designed to kind of talk about the future of warfare, right? And the last part of this, in many ways, synchronizes with what Shriver was saying earlier, that in the past we thought about warfare on land, and then we thought about warfare on sea, and then we thought about warfare in air. And now you have General White essentially saying it's just a natural extension. Space is next, much like inland sailors at one point just started to venture out on the high seas, and then it just kind of evolves from there. So once you have the Chief of Staff of the Air Force on board, you can probably bet that's going to be a priority for the service. So you're starting to get momentum within not just the scientific side of the Air Force, the research and engineering element. You're now getting buy-in from the Chief of Staff. And we'll talk about how that evolves as well. And again, 58, we're going to have Lieutenant General Donald Putt, who's works for the Chief of Staff. He's the Air Force Deputy Chief of Staff for Research and Development. So he comes much out of the vein of Shriver, right? And this is, I think, one of the final kind of elements of building this, at least, construct, right? That it's not just about a new domain. It's now about contesting the domain and or controlling the domain. So the idea is Putt puts up here that it really is about superiority, right? That if you want to ensure world peace, you need to maintain the ability to control and contest space to the Soviet Union. And that's much in line with what Everett Dolman talks about. And I'm a great fan of his writing. We use it in some classes on evolution of military thought, that he does a good job of talking about how if space really is the next operational medium, right, that you have to think about it much like we do land, air, and sea. And control and contest are two elements that you have to think about. And here you have Putt talking about this construct in 58, which is really, I think, the third piece of the puzzle as we start building this construct of aerospace. Now, why is the Air Force so concerned? And these are three pictures of Soviet systems. So you have a Soviet spy satellite, which is on the left-hand side, right? You have the long missile in the black and white, which is what the Soviets are going to come to call the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System, which is essentially, it's a satellite / nuclear warhead. So it's designed to do kind of a half orbit and then come out of its trajectory and then strike a target. And it's designed to do it on a southern trajectory, so it avoids the dew line and BMUS lines, which are radars looking over the North Pole. And this is an example of really the Air Force saying, if you don't defend space, control space, contest space, the Soviet Union are going to control it in leaps and bounds. And the one at the bottom really is, it's R7 with the ability to use either a satellite and or a nuclear warhead on it. So these are the intelligence on the Soviet system is driving the Air Force to essentially demonstrate to the Eisenhower administration that you can't sit and wait. You can't do that long game. You have to react, because if you sit and wait, the Soviets are going to steal a step on you or two. Eisenhower, for his part, is somewhat resistant, but he is going to allow the Air Force to develop military space systems. But they're going to be much more in the vein of the militarization of space, not weaponization of space. They're going to push, the Air Force is going to push for weaponization of space, even into the Kennedy administration. But this is really about this construct of aerospace. And really, it comes home to kind of roost really here in December 1959. So if you look at the timeline, it really is about just shy of 2 years, 57 to 59, when it really gets up and going. But if you want to take the long historian view, I think it probably starts kind of 45, 46 with that first RAND report, and it's going to come home to roost here in 59 when the word aerospace is first brought into the lexicon of the Air Force and really comes out in a doctrinal manual. And you can see the quote right there, right? An operational indivisible medium consisting of the total expanse of the Earth's surface, which is not quite the way we're thinking about it today, right? But for the Air Force, it makes complete sense that if you're in charge of air power, the next step becomes space power. So why not just merge those two, air and space, into aerospace? And once it gets into the Air Force doctrine, you start thinking about it as one continual operational medium, which makes complete sense. But they also want to ensure that it's kind of institutionalized. So they change things like their air power journal, Air University, into aerospace power. Now, the other services I really haven't talked about, because the other services are a bit miffed is probably a good word to use, that the Air Force is staking claim to space as their exclusive domain. And in fact, the Navy is giving them a pretty good run for their money as far as space systems, as is the Army to a lesser extent. But once the creation of NASA happens, the Army space program is going to kind of wither a bit and kind of attrit as elements like von Braun go off to work for NASA. But the Air Force does have to answer to Congress many times about, is this just an attempt for you to kind of gobble up more missions and more budget resources? And their answer is, well, no, we're just looking at the future of warfare and really looking at this domain as the logical extension of air power, which I think has some truth to it, but it also is about resources, as we know. But I honestly do believe that as you look at the evolution, that the Air Force does concern itself with what happens if you lose control of outer space. That will it have a profound impact on the United States, specifically as the United States, I would argue, probably up to the mid-60s is probably losing the space race. So on the civilian side, things aren't going that great. But on the military side, they're actually going phenomenally well with things like the Discovery / Corona program, which flies in 1960. And the first mission of the Corona satellite actually delivers much more photographs of the Soviet Union than the U-2 flights combined, which is pretty impressive. And again, you don't have to risk a aircraft and or a pilot. So here we have it in '59 that the Air Force has really embraced this construct of aerospace as one continual operational domain. Now, although they've made this theoretical claim, the problem is they don't develop a space force, right? So what you have is you have missileers and you have strategic air command, SAC, you have tactical air command, you have maintainers, you have intelligence folks, you have weather folks. So you have these kind of disparate elements in the Air Force, but yet the idea of a space command is going to kind of start to get legs early on, but it's going to be kind of suppressed because the reality is the Air Force's primary mission is still strategic air command and tactical air command and maintaining those sources. So space becomes a useful asset, but we're going to have to wait some decades before we get space command. But this construct of aerospace is significant, and it's going to kind of ebb and flow as we move through the Cold War. I would argue that its kind of height and its initial run probably lasts until probably the moon landing, and then in Vietnam era, post-Vietnam, it's going to kind of wither a bit, but then it'll come charging back when we start talking about multi-domain operations and space and cyber as the next contested domains. Okay. So with that, I will gladly take your questions. But before we get to questions, I want to make an announcement that the next one of these Fort Leavenworth Historical or Fort Leavenworth Dole Center presentation is going to be Dr. John Kuhn, who's going to give a lecture on alpha theta Mahan and sea power, which you'll see some linkages between the way the Air Force is thinking about space and the way Mahan talked about sea power, because I will make the argument that aerospace theory and space power borrows relatively heavily from alpha theta Mahan and sea power, as well as some of the classic geopolitical theorists. So Dr. Kuhn is a recognized expert on Mahan and sea power, so please tune into that event. And with that, I will take questions. All right, the first question is, you mentioned that there were two concurrent efforts, the Air Force militarized side and the civilian space exploration side. The question is, how did the U.S. communicate this to the country, and what was the public opinion? Great question. The military side isn't necessarily communicated very well to the public, by the way. Eisenhower is really about maintaining this, and I don't want to call it a facade because I think it is a unique adjustment between the two. Eisenhower focuses on the civilian space program and all the great things that are happening with that. And every once in a while, there's a discussion about the military space, and you see artist renditions of things. But the vast majority, at least during the Eisenhower administration, are highly classified, specifically Corona, Midas, Saint. So that isn't communicated at all. They're going to come out later under Lyndon Johnson. There's a handbook that's put out. There's a classified military version and a classified civilian version. And what they do is they just kind of swap language. So if you think about like weather satellites, right? A weather satellite can be used for both for military purposes and for civilian purposes. The way they convey that is they just have two versions. You have a civilian version, which is for public international consumption, talks about civilians, and then you have the classified version that talks about the military applications. And another example was predecessor to GPS was called Transit. It comes out in really, I think, 1960. It's really designed for submarine launched ballistic missiles to get a more accurate fix so that their accuracy as they launch their missiles can be greatly improved. The Johnson administration is going to release that to the civilian market because they believe it can be used by aircraft and or merchant marine or civilian marine elements to better navigate around storms and such. So there's a facade. You keep the military kind of dark. You keep the civilian side in the spotlight and kind of demonstrate everything. So great question. Second question: when was NASA founded? When was NASA founded, and has their role in space efforts changed much since the 1950s? Yeah, it's founded right on the heels of Sputnik, right? It's designed to demonstrate that we need to pour money into this, what we know as STEM right now, right? There's a significant discussion that the United States is lagging in science and engineering and research, and we need an agency that is going to pull those resources that are being held by really the services and maybe some foreign corporations into one administration, and you marshal those goals, efforts, and objectives towards one end, which is the exploration of space. I think it's changed somewhat because the Cold War's gone. So there's not this impetus that you have to do it to demonstrate how awesome you are. That I think it's evolved beyond the Cold War construct to the sense that is much more about legitimate science and engineering. That's to say that the research they did during the Cold War is illegitimate. It really is much more open now, whereas it is, I think, reaching kind of what Eisenhower and the original administrators saw it as is really an international element for all nations that are participating in. So if you look at some NASA projects now, it's a hodgepodge of nations from around the world, which I think is fantastic. Good question. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? You guys can't let me off the hook that easy, right? All right, now it's blowing up, right? All right, next one. What is the U.S.'s current approach to and view of space power? Is there still a struggle for power and control in space, especially when it comes to satellites? I think the debate right now, this is my opinion, right, that of DoD or the Army or any other agency, that we recognize space as a military domain, right? Multi-domain operations. It's land, sea, air, space, cyberspace. The struggle for power and control in space, it's still there, right? You see it with the formation of the Space Force, right? That there was a space command in the 90s, and each service kind of has their own space elements as part of it. But this move towards creating the Space Force creates some consternation, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. If you do view space as a strategic operational strategic medium that you're going to have to possibly fight in, you probably need a force dedicated to it, much like air power, sea power, land power. Satellites now, each service has satellites, right? We rely on them for communication, navigation, you name it. I would assume Space Force will at some point control all those assets, but right now Space Force has some, and the services still retain their own individual assets that they use as they see fit. Good question. Think about Space Force much like the Air Force, right? So it starts off kind of in the Signal Corps. No one really knows what to do with it. There's debates about should it be independent or not, right? Through World War I, World War II, and it does become independent, and then there's a fight over roles and missions. I think Space Force is going to go through a kind of a similar evolution, by the way. So we're still relatively early in the process. So we just have to wait and see. All right, next question. What is today's new frontier? To be tackled as space was a new frontier in the 40s, 50s, and 60s? Great question. I don't know. I'm a historian, right? I think the Mars element's kind of interesting, right? And the missions to Mars, where we're flying kind of, for lack of a better word, helicopters on Mars, as are the Chinese, and we're exploring it. So that may be the new frontier. There's discussions about the deep ocean, that we actually know less about the deep ocean of the world than we do about, or we know less than we do, we know more about space than deep ocean. So that's probably another potential, but, the deeper exploration of space, other planets is, I think, where we're kind of headed right now with, missions back to the moon first and then beyond the moon. It seems to lose some of its panache because you don't have that construct of racing anymore like you had in the Cold War. But I think the moon mission can kind of peak some of that for a new generation. I think the civilian attempts to go to space is driving that somewhat too. And I think a mission to Mars is definitely interesting and will definitely push the scientific engineering parameters. So I think that's probably the next frontier. All right, final question, right? How did you become interested in the Cold War and find your specialization? Great question. I don't even know how to answer that question. I just always been fascinated by, I guess, the Soviet Union and the United States, and this war. But it's not like, you know, a World War I sense. It's kind of an ideological construct, but you're also using, you know, you're using space, you're using, you know, refrigerators, you're using nuclear weapons as a means to demonstrate to the world that, you know, you're a superior power. So I think that kind of non-kinetic side, where it's a bit intellectual, it's a bit diplomatic, it's a bit economic. There is definitely military there. The prospect of nuclear weapons is intriguing to me. I have a master's degree in strategic studies, so I spent a lot of time talking and thinking about nuclear strategy and nuclear weapons and arms control. And I found my specialization at that. I actually started out life as a political scientist up through a master's degree. Thought maybe the Cold War would come back. It didn't. So I thought the natural extension was to become a historian, and my awesome wife supported that endeavor and allowed me to go get a PhD. So I just kind of stumbled into it. Always fascinated by it. The political science side was great. Thought maybe I'd go to law school, but the deeper I got into studying the Cold War and the dynamic elements from 45 to 89, it just kind of pulled me in further and further. So find something you're passionate about and go with it, which is, you know, kind of how I found it. So I guess it's kind of serendipity, but you kind of always knew it was there if you kind of look back on your life. So if you're a grad student or want to be a student, go for it. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for our program this afternoon. If you are a student and would like to join the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Our fall programming schedule will be announced soon. Sign up for the Dole Institute email list to be the first to know about upcoming events by going to doleinstitute.org and clicking Get Updates. Refer to doleinstitute.org for up-to-date information on all of our upcoming programs. We hope you enjoyed this afternoon's program. Thank you, and we will virtually see you next time.